Olivia Carter sat in her Chicago apartment on the morning of Thanksgiving, staring at the city skyline through her window. The familiar sense of unease settled in her chest as she prepared for yet another family gathering. This year's destination was the Breakers, an opulent resort in Palm Beach, Florida, where her family had chosen to celebrate the holiday. It was an annual tradition, completely funded by her grandfather, William Carter, a self-made businessman who had built his fortune in the construction industry. While other families came together for warmth and shared appreciation, Olivia's Thanksgiving was always an exercise in endurance, a reminder of the favoritism and fractured relationships that had defined her place in the Carter family for as long as she could remember. At 33, Olivia had worked tirelessly to build a life of independence and stability. As the director of research at a pharmaceutical company, she earned $160 a year, a salary she had achieved through years of determination, discipline, and unwavering commitment to her career. Every financial decision she made was rooted in the lessons taught by her grandfather, who had always emphasized the importance of standing on one's own feet. From a young age, William had instilled in her a sense of responsibility and financial awareness. Teaching her the value of investments and long-term planning, she had followed his guidance, ensuring that every step she took led toward a future where she would never have to rely on anyone. Her high-rise apartment, her well-managed investments, and her debt-free life were proof that she had built something solid. Something that could not be taken away from her. In stark contrast was her younger sister, Madison, who had chosen a very different path. Once a flight attendant, Madison had left her job after getting married, opting instead for a lifestyle that appeared glamorous on the surface but was entirely unsustainable. Her social media painted a picture of effortless luxury, weekend getaways to tropical destinations, designer handbags, fine dining at high-end restaurants, and extravagant shopping sprees. However, the reality was far less impressive. Every aspect of Madison's lifestyle, from her sprawling home to her daughter's private school tuition, was funded entirely by William. Without his financial support, Madison's image of affluence would crumble in an instant. Their parents, Richard and Susan, were no different. They lived in Florida, enjoying what seemed to be a well-planned retirement. Yet everything about their lifestyle depended on William's generosity, from their medical expenses to the deposit for the high-end retirement home they had secured. Every major financial decision was made under the assumption that William's wealth would always be there to sustain them. Unlike Olivia, who had spent her college years balancing part-time jobs and academic scholarships, Madison had been given everything she needed. Their parents had paid for her study abroad programs, her education, and even her wedding, while Olivia had learned early on that if she wanted something, she had to earn it herself. The disparity had always been clear, and no matter how much success Olivia achieved on her own, her place in the family remained unchanged. Thanksgiving, for Olivia, had never felt like a true homecoming. It was a performance, an annual event where Madison played the role of the beloved daughter. Their parents basked in their comfortable illusion of family unity, and Olivia stood quietly on the sidelines, an outsider in her own bloodline. She had never fought for attention or demanded the same level of support her sister had received. But as the years passed, she had grown tired of pretending that their dynamic was anything other than what it was. She attended these gatherings out of obligation, not out of any real desire to be there. As she zipped up her suitcase, preparing for the flight to Palm Beach, she exhaled deeply, knowing that this trip would be no different from the ones before. The Breakers was a magnificent hotel, an architectural masterpiece with soaring ceilings, lavish chandeliers, and rooms that cost more per night than most people made in a week. The Thanksgiving dinner alone, priced at $200 per person, was a testament to the kind of wealth her family enjoyed, wealth that had never been hers to share. Despite the opulence, Olivia knew that behind the grandeur, their reality was fragile. Madison's designer lifestyle, their parents' retirement comfort, none of it was built on their own achievements. It was a house of cards, upheld solely by William's willingness to provide. As she stepped into the taxi that would take her to the airport, she found herself reflecting on the conversations she had overheard in previous years. Madison often spoke about financial matters as though they were trivial, casually mentioning how their grandfather covered her daughter's tuition or how their parents never had to worry about medical bills. Their parents, in turn, had always justified their reliance on William, treating his support as an unspoken obligation rather than a privilege. It had always baffled Olivia how they lived so comfortably under the assumption that the money would always flow, as though their grandfather's generosity had no limits. She wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if that support were to disappear. Could Madison maintain her lifestyle without the steady stream of financial assistance? Would their parents still be able to afford the life they had built? Olivia had spent years ensuring she would never be in a position where she had to ask those questions for herself. She had never taken William's money, not because it was not offered, but because she had always wanted to know that everything she had earned. The taxi wove through the streets of Chicago, heading toward the airport as Olivia stared out the window. The weight of the upcoming family gathering pressed against her chest, a reminder that no matter how successful she became, she would always be treated as less than Madison in their parents' eyes. But something about this year felt different. Perhaps it was the growing disconnect she felt, the realization that she no longer cared to play her role in their carefully maintained charade. She had always known she was different from them, but for the first time, she felt a quiet certainty that she no longer needed to prove herself to anyone. She was not envious of Madison's life. She was not resentful of her parents' choices. She was simply done trying to fit into a family that had never truly made space for her. The thought was both sobering and liberating. As the plane took off, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she no longer felt the need to attend these gatherings, where she could spend her holidays in peace rather than in quiet discomfort. She had built a life that was stable, successful, and completely her own, and, whether her family recognized it or not, that was something far more valuable than the fleeting illusion of wealth that Madison and her parents had clung to for so long. As Olivia Carter sat in the back of the taxi, watching the breakers fade into the distance, she felt an odd sense of peace. The Grand Hotel, with its Italian Renaissance architecture and perfectly curated luxury, had been the backdrop for many of her family's Thanksgiving gatherings. But today, it was merely a symbol of the past she was leaving behind. The warm Florida air drifted through the slightly cracked window. Yet she felt no sadness, no regret, only a growing certainty that walking away had been the right choice. She glanced at her phone, contemplating whether to make the call she had been thinking about since she left the hotel lobby. She knew her grandfather would want to know what had happened. He had always been the only person in her family who truly understood her, the only one who had ever valued her independence. With a deep breath, she dialed his number and waited. After a few rings, William Carter answered, his voice steady as always. "Olivia," he said, immediately sensing that something was wrong. She took a moment before replying. "I have something to report," she said, keeping her voice composed. She recounted the events at the hotel, detailing how Madison had deliberately excluded her from the reservation, how their parents had turned away instead of defending her, and how she had chosen to leave rather than fight for a place where she was clearly not wanted. She expected her grandfather to be disappointed, perhaps even surprised, but the silence on the other end told her something else. He was angry. "I understand," he finally said, his voice low and deliberate. "I'll handle this from here." That was all he needed to say. Olivia knew what those words meant, and she knew the consequences of her family's actions would be swift. William Carter was a man of principle, a self-made businessman who had spent his life building his wealth from the ground up. He valued discipline, responsibility, and integrity above all else. And if there was one thing he could not stand, it was entitlement. As the taxi pulled into the airport, Olivia found herself feeling lighter than she had in years. She checked her phone again, noticing the first wave of missed calls and messages from her sister and mother. Madison had sent several, each one growing more frantic. "Olivia, answer your phone." Then another. "This is ridiculous. Amy was looking forward to seeing you." A third came soon after. "You need to talk to Grandpa. He's overreacting. Fix this." Her mother's messages followed a similar pattern, starting with dismissiveness, then shifting to blame. "We could have added another room. But you're independent now, aren't you? Another message followed. Why are you being so emotional? Olivia sighed and turned off her phone as she walked toward her gate. By the time she landed in Chicago, the real chaos had begun. When she turned her phone back on, the flood of notifications was overwhelming. Her family had finally realized what her grandfather's decision truly meant. An email from William had been sent to every family member. And as Olivia read through it, she knew that the life they had taken for granted was about to change forever. Effective immediately, all financial support to Richard, Susan, and Madison is terminated. Those who have lived comfortably on my generosity while forgetting the values of dignity, integrity, and family no longer qualify for my assistance. Consider this the consequence of your own choices. Any objections will result in the termination of any remaining assets tied to my name. Olivia could only imagine the sheer panic that must have spread through her parents' house and Madison's perfectly decorated home. Without William's financial support, their entire lifestyle was unsustainable. Madison had built her world on an illusion, portraying herself as a wealthy socialite while secretly relying on the steady stream of money that had never been hers to begin with. Her house, her car, her designer wardrobe, none of it had been earned. Her husband, who had long suspected that their finances were not as secure as Madison had claimed, finally saw the truth. The mortgage payments were overdue. The credit card statements revealed debts he hadn't known existed. Their daughter's private school tuition was no longer covered, forcing Madison to enroll her in a public school, something she had once laughed at as beneath her. The facade had crumbled, and there was no salvaging it. Meanwhile, Olivia's parents were facing their own reality check. They had already paid a $150 deposit for a high-end retirement home, assuming William would continue to support them indefinitely. Without his financial backing, they couldn't afford to pay the remaining balance, and the thought of losing that money sent them into a state of desperation. Their medical expenses, once comfortably covered, were now a looming burden. Downsizing became their only option, forcing them to leave behind the illusion of luxury they had clung to for so long. Olivia read through the increasingly frantic messages her family had sent her. Madison's tone had shifted from anger to pleading. Olivia, please, I need your help. Grandpa won't listen to me, but he'll listen to you. You have to fix this. Her mother's emails followed the same trajectory. We made mistakes, but this is too much. You're just going to let this happen? We're family. Her father's messages were more direct. You need to talk to him. This is about more than just us, it's about Amy, too. Olivia put her phone down and took a long sip of tea as she stared out over the Chicago skyline. She had spent years being treated as an afterthought in her own family. And now, when they needed something from her, they expected her to fix their mess. But she wouldn't. She had spent too long building a life free from their manipulations to be pulled back in now. Her grandfather sent her one final message. Brief but meaningful. Awakening to the truth of life is painful, but necessary. Your decision gave them a lesson they refused to learn on their own. I'm proud of you. She saved the email but did not reply. There was nothing left to say. She had spent her entire life being reminded that she was not Madison. That she was not the favored daughter. That she was not the one who would ever be chosen first. Now, they were learning that she did not need to be. As the days passed, the emails and calls began to slow. Madison's Instagram, once filled with curated snapshots of luxury, fell silent. The private school tuition payments had stopped. The extravagant vacations had ended. And her once perfect life had become something far more ordinary. Olivia's parents had stopped sending demands and had begun sending apologies, though whether they were genuine or just another attempt to regain what they had lost, she did not know. Olivia's life, however, remained the same. She continued going to work, managing her investments, and living within her means, just as she always had. She had never needed their money. She had never needed their validation. And now, more than ever, she understood the full power of being able to stand on her own feet. As Olivia Carter stepped off the plane and into the crisp Chicago air, she felt the weight of the past few days begin to lift. Thanksgiving had ended before it had even begun for her, but she did not regret the way things had unfolded. For the first time in years, She had made a choice that placed her dignity above her obligation to a family that had never truly valued her. As she rode home in a taxi, watching the city skyline come into view, she realized that the freedom she felt now was worth far more than any carefully curated family gathering could have ever offered. She spent the next morning as she always did, sipping tea by the window, scrolling through work emails, and mentally preparing for the week ahead. But by mid-afternoon, her phone started vibrating again, the wave of missed calls and messages flooding in just as it had since she left the breakers. She had ignored them on the plane, ignored them in the airport. But now, curiosity got the better of her. She unlocked her phone, scrolling through the growing list of messages. Madison had called at least 20 times, and the messages that accompanied them had transformed from frustration to sheer panic. The first few were predictable. Olivia, what the hell? You really left? Then, stop being dramatic. We can work this out. By the next day, the messages had taken on a much different tone. Grandpa cut us off. He's serious. Do something. You know what this means for me. Her mother's emails were more passive-aggressive at first, a continuation of the same dismissiveness she had always shown toward Olivia. We could have just added another room. But you always have to make things difficult. Then, as reality sank in, the messages became desperate. Your father and I are in trouble. You need to talk to him. The retirement home won't refund our deposit. We're going to lose everything. Olivia set the phone down, letting the words settle over her. She had spent her entire life watching her family live under the assumption that money would always be there for them. Her parents had never planned for their own future, had never once considered what life would look like without her grandfather's support. They had spent recklessly, choosing to indulge in comfort without ever taking responsibility for the consequences. Madison had done the same, flaunting wealth that was never hers, living a life that had always been one step away from collapse. And now, that collapse had come. Her grandfather had not been bluffing when he sent that final email. Effective immediately, all financial support to Richard, Susan, and Madison is terminated. Those who have lived comfortably on my generosity while forgetting the values of dignity, integrity, and family no longer qualify for my assistance. Consider this the consequence of your own choices. Any objections will result in the termination of any remaining assets tied to my name. For the first time in their lives, her parents and sister were being forced to face a world without the financial safety net they had always relied on. Madison, who had never worked a single day since leaving her job as a flight attendant, suddenly found herself unable to keep up with her lifestyle. The mortgage on her house, the car payments, the tuition for her daughter's private school, none of it was sustainable without the $30,000 monthly allowance she had once taken for granted. Her husband, who had long suspected that their finances were not as stable as she had pretended, had reached his breaking point. His frustration boiled over in late-night arguments. And Olivia imagined that for the first time, Madison was experiencing what it meant to struggle. Her parents, meanwhile, were facing their own reckoning. The high-end retirement home they had been preparing to move into was no longer an option. And with no refund on their deposit, they were left scrambling for alternatives. Medical bills that had once been an afterthought were now an overwhelming burden. They had to accept the unthinkable. They would need to downsize. Leave behind the life they had so carefully built on borrowed wealth. And adjust to a reality they had never prepared for. The emails and messages continued to pour in over the next few days. Madison was no longer trying to hide her panic. Olivia, please. I can't do this. I have no idea how to handle this mess. Grandpa won't even take my calls. He won't listen to me. But he'll listen to you. Just fix this. Her mother's tone had shifted as well. From scolding to pleading. We made mistakes. But you can't just let this happen to your own family. You have to understand how much we need you right now. But Olivia did understand. She understood perfectly. She had spent her entire life being treated as if she were an outsider. An afterthought. The one who was expected to be self-sufficient while Madison was showered with love and financial security. She had never asked for their money. She had never expected their support. And now, when they had lost everything, they had turned to her. The one they had always dismissed. As if she owed them something. She didn't. As she sat in her apartment, the city lights flickering outside her window, she took a long breath and made her decision. She would not be calling her grandfather to reverse his decision. She would not be offering to help her parents get back on their feet. She would not be swooping in to save Madison from the consequences of her own choices. For the first time, they would have to face the world on their own, just as she always had. Her phone buzzed one last time, and she glanced at the screen. Another missed call from Madison. Another email from her mother. Subject line reading urgent. She turned the phone over, silencing the notifications. She had always been the one who stood alone, the one who had no choice but to carve out her own path. Now, it was their turn, and Olivia was finally free. As the weeks passed, Olivia Carter's life remained unchanged. She woke up early, went to work at the pharmaceutical company where she had recently been promoted, and spent her evenings in quiet solitude, enjoying the peace she had built for herself. Her salary had increased to $200,000 a year. Her investments were performing well, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly untethered. There were no obligations weighing her down. No forced family gatherings. No expectations to be the quiet, overlooked presence in a household that had never made room for her. She had chosen herself, and it was a decision she did not regret. Her family, on the other hand, had been thrust into an unfamiliar world, without the financial safety net that had cushioned their lives for so long. They were forced to face the consequences of their own mismanagement. Madison, who had once lived in the comfort of an illusion, was now dealing with the reality of financial instability. Without their grandfather's money, her perfect life had begun to unravel at an alarming pace. The mortgage payments on her house were overdue, and her husband, having finally seen the truth of their financial situation, had started pulling away. Their daughter, who had spent her childhood in the most prestigious private schools, was now being transferred to a public school. The luxury vacations, the designer shopping sprees, and the carefully curated lifestyle she had flaunted on social media had come to an abrupt halt. Her Instagram, once filled with snapshots of opulence, had gone silent. Her parents were struggling just as much. The exclusive retirement home they had planned to move into was no longer an option. And without a refund on their deposit, they were left scrambling for alternatives. The loss of financial support had hit them in ways they had never anticipated. Their medical insurance, once covered by their grandfather's generosity, now had to be paid out of pocket. The reality of their new situation was setting in quickly, forcing them to downsize, to sell off unnecessary luxuries, and to adjust to a world they had never prepared for. Their once comfortable life, built on the assumption that money would always be there, had become a precarious balancing act. Olivia continued to receive messages from them, though their tone had changed. Madison was no longer demanding or accusing her of ruining everything. Instead, her messages were filled with panic and regret. "Olivia, please, I need to talk to you. I don't know what to do. Grandpa won't take my calls. And I don't know how to fix this. I know we haven't always been close, but you're the only one who can help me now." Her mother's emails were much the same, a far cry from the dismissive tone she had always used with Olivia in the past. "We understand that we made mistakes, but we are still your family. We are in real trouble, and we need you. Please don't turn your back on us." She read them all, but she did not respond. There was nothing left to say. She had spent her life watching them live recklessly, never once considering the future, always assuming that someone else would be there to catch them if they fell. They had built their lives on borrowed wealth, on the illusion that security did not require effort. And now, faced with the truth, they expected her to step in and fix everything. But Olivia had built her life differently. She had spent years making sure she would never be in the position they were in now. She had worked, saved, invested, and planned for a future where she would never have to ask anyone for help. Her grandfather's final message remained in her inbox, a quiet confirmation that she had made the right choice. "Awakening to the truth of life is painful, but necessary. Your decision gave them a lesson they refused to learn on their own. I am proud of you." She had not responded to that email either, but she had read it more than once. Letting the words settle into her mind, she thought about her niece, Amy, The only person in the family she had ever felt any real connection to. In the back of her drawer, the pearl hair clip she had bought for her still sat, untouched and wrapped in its original box. Olivia had planned to give it to her on Thanksgiving. A small tradition she had kept over the years. But that day had come and gone. And Olivia had left before she even had the chance to see her. She wondered if Amy had asked about her. If she had noticed her absence. If she had understood the shift happening within the family. Maybe one day, when she was older, she would. Maybe one day, she would recognize the difference between a life built on appearances and one built on true stability. And maybe then, the gift would find its way to her. Outside her window, the Chicago skyline sparkled in the evening light. The world moving forward as it always did. Olivia took a slow sip of her tea, feeling the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had done the right thing. She had not been cruel. She had not sought revenge. She had not wished for their downfall. She had simply stepped away. Let them face the world on their own terms. And in doing so, she had freed herself. For years, she had been treated as if she were less than. As if her achievements were insignificant. As if she was not as important as Madison. And now, in their time of need, they had turned to her. The daughter they had overlooked. The sister they had excluded. But she owed them nothing. She had built her life on her own. And she would continue to do so. And for the first time, she truly felt the meaning of independence. This story is a reminder that family is not about blood, it is about respect, integrity, and mutual support. Walking away is not always easy. But sometimes, it is necessary to protect your own happiness. Olivia's story is not just about financial independence, but emotional freedom, the power to step away from toxic relationships and create a life truly worth living. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful stories that remind us all of the importance of self-worth, resilience, and choosing the life we truly deserve. She clicked on the post, and the truth hit her like a punch to the gut. The photo showed her entire family, her parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, even her grandmother, gathered around Jessica's beautifully decorated dining table, laughing, wearing festive sweaters, and raising their glasses in a toast. There was no ice storm. There had never been an ice storm. The lie was so obvious that Emily almost felt foolish for believing it in the first place. Through the windows in the background, she could see clear, sunny skies. The roads were dry. There was no reason for them to cancel anything, except to exclude her. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through more photos. Her father carving the turkey. Her mother arranging the same Christmas cookies Emily had helped bake every year. Her little nieces and nephews opening presents. Every single person she loved. All together. Except her. The realization stung more than she had expected. It wasn't just this one event, it was the years of exclusion. The carefully orchestrated lies to keep her at arm's length. How many other times had they forgotten to invite her? Spun excuses about cancelled plans. Or simply omitted her from their family moments? How long had they been doing this? Emily had always brushed off these incidents, telling herself that she was just overthinking things. That her family loved her. Just in a quieter way. That maybe she really was just different. But this was intentional. The next morning, her phone rang. Her mother's name lit up on the screen. "Hi honey, hope you had a nice, quiet Christmas. We missed you." Emily stared at her phone. Disbelief turning into something sharper. Something dangerously close to anger. Her mother sounded so casual. So unbothered. As if she truly believed Emily wouldn't find out. As if she hadn't just been caught in a lie that shattered everything. For the first time in her life, Emily didn't ignore the feeling twisting in her chest. She didn't swallow her pain and pretend it didn't matter. She didn't let it go. Instead, she took a deep breath and asked the question that had been burning in her mind all night. Really? Because Sarah's Instagram post shows everyone had a wonderful time at Jessica's house. Everyone except me. A long silence stretched between them. Emily could almost hear her mother scrambling for an excuse. Trying to think of a way to spin this in her favor. "Oh, well, it was all last minute. Sweetheart, We didn't want you to feel obligated to come. You know how you are at gatherings, always so quiet. Making things a little tense. Emily clenched her jaw. Tense? We just thought it would be better this way. Jessica wanted everything to be perfect. It wasn't personal. It wasn't personal. The words echoed in Emily's mind. And suddenly, everything was clear. Every last-minute cancelled event. Every spontaneous family gathering she had found out about too late. Every dismissive remark about how she was too busy with work to be involved. It was never a mistake. It was never an accident. It was always intentional. How many other times have you lied to me? Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. Her mother hesitated, and that hesitation told Emily everything she needed to know. Catherine, you're being oversensitive, her mother finally said. This is exactly why. Why what? Emily cut her off. Why you exclude me? Why you pretend I don't exist unless you need something? Why Jessica gets to be the perfect daughter while I'm treated like an inconvenience? That's not fair, her mother protested. We love you both equally. It's just, Jessica puts in the effort to be part of the family. You're always so busy with work. Emily let out a bitter laugh. Busy? You mean busy helping pay your mortgage? Busy taking care of Dad after his surgery? That kind of busy? Listen, her mother's voice turned stern. If you're going to be like this, maybe it's best if we give each other some space. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. And just like that, she hung up. Emily sat there, staring at her phone, feeling something inside her shift. For 32 years, she had made excuses for them. For 32 years, she had convinced herself that if she just worked harder, gave more, proved herself, maybe they would finally see her as part of the family. But the truth was simple. She wasn't the problem. She never had been. And for the first time in her life, she stopped trying to earn love that was never freely given. From the moment she was old enough to notice, Emily had always felt like an outsider in her own family. It wasn't that they were outright cruel to her, no. It was much more subtle than that. It was the kind of favoritism that didn't look obvious from the outside but cut deeper with every passing year. Growing up, Emily tried to be the perfect daughter. She studied hard, got straight A's, and never caused trouble. She helped her mother cook, cleaned up after dinner without being asked, and always made sure to be available whenever her parents needed her. Yet, no matter how much she did, it was never enough, because Jessica, her younger sister, was always the one who shined. Jessica was the fun one, the social butterfly who could charm anyone with a smile. She wasn't particularly responsible, nor was she exceptionally talented in school. But she had a way of making people adore her. Their parents doted on her, showering her with attention and praise for even the smallest of accomplishments. Emily, on the other hand, was expected to take care of things. To be the responsible one. The reliable one. She remembered one particular birthday, Jessica's 16th. Their parents had thrown a lavish party, renting out a venue, inviting over 100 guests, and gifting her a brand new car. When Emily had turned 16, she had received a small family dinner and a savings bond with the vague promise of, "This will help you one day." It had been like that her entire life. When Jessica got a C in math, their parents hired a private tutor. When Emily struggled in her advanced chemistry course, they told her to figure it out because you're the smart one. When Jessica quit college to pursue yoga full-time, their parents called her brave and independent. When Emily worked long hours to pay off her student loans, they called her too obsessed with work. She convinced herself that none of it mattered, that as long as she kept doing her best, she would eventually be recognized for her hard work. That if she just tried a little harder, gave a little more, maybe, just maybe, she would finally be seen as an equal to Jessica. But it never happened. 3 years ago, when their father needed surgery, Emily took 3 weeks off work to care for him. She cooked, cleaned, managed his medications, and made sure he was comfortable. Jessica, on the other hand, showed up once, took a few selfies for social media, and left, claiming she had a yoga retreat she simply couldn't miss. Yet, in their parents' retelling of that time, Jessica was the devoted daughter who made time to visit, while Emily was simply doing what was expected. That was the moment she should have realized the truth. The favoritism wasn't unconscious. It was deliberate. But she ignored the signs, excusing their behavior again and again. Even last Thanksgiving, Emily had spent hours in the kitchen helping their mother prepare the meal. Only to hear her mother proudly tell the guests that Jessica put so much effort into the cooking this year. Jessica had barely set foot in the kitchen. Still, Emily swallowed her feelings and smiled. Because that's what she had been taught to do. Then came last Christmas. When Jessica announced she would be hosting dinner, Emily had eagerly offered to help with the planning. But Jessica had waved her off, saying she wanted everything to be perfect this year. Emily hadn't questioned it, not until that Christmas morning, when she received her mother's text. Christmas dinner is cancelled due to the ice storm. Stay safe, honey. Not until she saw the Instagram post of her entire family gathered around Jessica's dining table, laughing and celebrating. Not until she realized that the ice storm had been a lie. That was the moment the illusion shattered. How many other times had they lied? How many other events had they secretly held without her? Had they ever truly wanted her there at all? For years, Emily had convinced herself that she was imagining things, that she was simply being too sensitive. But the truth was undeniable now. She was never a real part of their world. She had been an outsider from the start. Emily sat frozen, staring at the documents spread before her. Her hands trembled as she flipped through bank statements, legal paperwork, and property records, all of it pointing to a truth more painful than she could have imagined. Her parents had stolen from her. For years, she had worked tirelessly, struggling to make ends meet while unknowingly being robbed of what was rightfully hers. The inheritance her grandfather had left specifically for her education and future, nearly $300, had been secretly funneled into Jessica's lifestyle. Her father, as the trustee of the inheritance, had been responsible for ensuring that the money was used according to their grandfather's wishes. Instead, he had transferred it to Jessica's accounts, labeling it as family investments, investments that had funded her sister's extravagant lifestyle, her failed business ventures, and her numerous yoga retreats in Bali. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process it all. All those years she had worked overtime to pay for her accounting degree, racking up student loan debt, when the money to cover it had been sitting in a bank account she never even knew existed. All those times her parents had praised Jessica for pursuing her passions, while subtly criticizing Emily for always being stressed about money. They had watched her struggle, and they had said nothing. Her mother's words from their last conversation echoed in her mind. Jessica puts in the effort to be part of the family. You're always so busy with work. Busy with work. She had been working to survive while they had been funding Jessica's vacations. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. But it didn't stop there. Buried within the documents was something even worse, a legal form she had signed when she was 18. Believing it was just a medical power of attorney. In reality, it had granted her parents control over her financial interests, allowing them to sell off property left to her and Jessica by their grandfather. Property that should have been equally divided. Property that had all been sold, with every dollar going into Jessica's name. Emily's stomach turned as she thought about all the times she had helped her parents financially. The months she had chipped in to help them with their mortgage. The times she had covered expensive medical bills for them, assuming they were struggling. The moments she had cut back on her own expenses so that she could send them extra money whenever they asked. All while they had been sitting on money that belonged to her. She felt sick. Her father had stolen from her. Her mother had covered it up. Jessica had spent it without a second thought. And none of them had ever felt a shred of guilt. She clenched her fists, her entire body shaking with a mix of fury and grief. How could they do this? How could they lie to her face for years and pretend to love her while stealing from her? She had given them everything. Her time, her effort, her money, and they had repaid her by robbing her blind. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. She was an accountant. She understood financial fraud. And this? This was more than just betrayal. This was a crime. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Sarah, she said when her lawyer answered. Yes, Emily? I need to know exactly what legal options I have. She could almost hear Sarah sit up straighter on the other end of the line. "Tell me everything," her lawyer said. Emily glanced at the documents again, her anger hardening into something cold and resolute. She had spent her entire life trying to earn her parents' love. But now? She was done. This time, she wasn't going to fight for their approval. She was going to fight for justice. Emily sat at her dining table, her fingers drumming against the thick folder of documents before her. The weight of betrayal still hung heavy in her chest. But now it was accompanied by something sharper. Something colder, determination. For years, she had been overlooked, dismissed, and lied to. But this time, she held the evidence in her hands. And for the first time in her life, she had the power. She had given her parents and Jessica one last chance, a final opportunity to come clean. To admit what they had done. And to make it right. But instead of remorse, they had chosen arrogance. "You're being dramatic, Emily. It was just family money. Why are you acting like this is such a big deal?" Jessica needed the support. "You always had a good job. You didn't really need the money." Her father's words still echoed in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Didn't need the money? She had spent years working herself to exhaustion, taking on extra shifts, sacrificing vacations, and living frugally just to stay afloat. All while they had been funding Jessica's lavish lifestyle behind her back. And now, they wanted to dismiss it like it was nothing? No. She wasn't letting them get away with it. She pulled out her phone and dialed her lawyer. "Sarah, they're not going to cooperate," Emily said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to move forward." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I've already prepared the filings. We'll move forward with legal action immediately." Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, then exhaled. It was time. The day of the confrontation arrived. And Emily sat in her lawyer's office, a folder of evidence in front of her. Across the table sat her parents and Jessica, looking tense, irritated. They had expected a conversation, a family discussion. They had no idea what was coming. Sarah leaned forward, setting down the legal papers with a quiet but firm thud. "Let's be clear about what's happening here," Sarah began. "We have documented financial fraud, unauthorized use of funds, and power of attorney abuse. Emily has every legal right to pursue criminal charges. This is your one chance to make it right." Her mother scoffed. "This is ridiculous. Emily, you're seriously threatening your own family over money?" Emily met her mother's gaze. Unwavering. "You stole from me. You used my inheritance to fund Jessica's life while I worked myself to exhaustion. This isn't just about money. This is about years of betrayal." Jessica crossed her arms, her face twisted with indignation. "I didn't even know where the money came from. I thought Mom and Dad were just helping me out." Emily slammed a document down in front of her, then explained the multiple transfers labeled Jessica's business fund. "You knew exactly what you were receiving." Jessica paled, but her mother stepped in again, her voice hardening. "We're family. You're making a mistake, Emily." Emily let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "No. The mistake was believing you ever valued me the way you valued Jessica." She turned to her father, her voice ice cold. "You were the trustee of my inheritance. That was my money, and you stole it, and unless you return every cent, I will see you in court." Her father's face turned red. "You wouldn't dare." Emily slid a court summons across the table. "I already did." Silence. For the first time, real fear flickered across their faces. Her mother's jaw clenched, Jessica's lip trembled, and her father's hands curled into fists. They had spent years believing she would never stand up for herself. They were wrong. "You have 48 hours," Sarah said. "Return the money, sign the confession, and agree to restitution, or we proceed with formal charges." Jessica looked at their parents in desperation. "Mom? Dad? We can't let this happen." Her father swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling. He knew the law wasn't on his side. He knew Emily wasn't bluffing. But his pride still held him back. "Think about what this will do to the family." He tried one last time. "Do you really want to destroy everything?" Emily stood, gathering her things. "You destroyed it," she said. "I'm just making sure you face the consequences." As she walked out of the office, she felt lighter than she had in years. They had stolen from her. But now? She was taking back what was hers. Emily sat in her new office. The soft hum of conversation from her employees filling the space around her. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the sleek, modern desk where she worked. She glanced at the framed document on the wall, her business license for the consulting firm she had started just 6 months ago. It had been a year since she had walked away from her family. A year since she had stopped waiting for their approval and started living for herself. And yet, even now, there were moments when the weight of the past tried to creep back in. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She hesitated before picking it up, already knowing who it was. Mom. Emily. It's been too long. Can we talk? She stared at the message for a long time, feeling nothing. No anger, no sadness, just nothing. It was strange how time had changed things. There had been a time when she would have dropped everything at the smallest hint of reconciliation. A time when she would have convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But she knew better now. She placed the phone back down without responding. Looking back, Emily could hardly believe how much her life had changed. In the weeks following her legal battle with her parents, she had gone through a whirlwind of emotions. At first, there had been anger, raw and overwhelming. She had spent years trying to be the good daughter, the responsible one, the person who always did what was expected. And what had that gotten her? A stolen inheritance, years of financial struggle, and a family that had never truly valued her. Then, there had been grief, not for what she had lost, but for what had never been. She had mourned the idea of the family she had spent her whole life chasing, realizing that it had only ever existed in her head. But after the anger and grief, something else had settled in. Peace. For the first time in her life, she was free. No more being the afterthought. No more being the family's backup plan. No more waiting for love that would never come. She had taken the settlement money from her lawsuit against her parents and used it to wipe out her student loans, debts she never should have had in the first place. Then, she had taken the rest and invested it into herself. Something she had never allowed herself to do before. A business, a new home, a fresh start. She had left the city she had spent her whole life in, moving to a place where no one knew her as Jessica's less interesting sister, or the responsible one, or the girl who was always working. Here, she was just Emily, and that was enough. One afternoon, she was in a meeting when her assistant knocked on the door. Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. Emily frowned. I don't have any appointments. Her assistant hesitated. It's Jessica. A cold, familiar weight settled in Emily's chest. She hadn't spoken to her sister in over a year. Send her in, she said, her voice steady. A few moments later, Jessica walked in, looking nothing like the sister Emily remembered. Gone was the polished, effortlessly put-together woman who had always been the center of attention. Instead, she looked tired, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her hands as though it was the only thing holding her together. Wow, Jessica murmured, glancing around the office. This is impressive. Emily said nothing, waiting. Jessica sighed, sitting down across from her. I don't know where to start. Try the beginning, Emily said, her tone unreadable. Jessica swallowed, looking down. Things have been hard. After everything that happened, Mom and Dad blamed me. They said I should have convinced you to let it go. They shut me out after they lost the case. Dad can't find work, and Mom refuses to leave the house. Emily nodded, unsurprised. Their parents had spent years pretending they were untouchable. Losing everything had probably shattered them. And you? She asked. Jessica hesitated. I lost the studio. The settlement took most of my savings. I tried to start over. But I don't know how. I've never had to do it alone before. Emily leaned back in her chair. And what do you want from me? Jessica flinched. I don't know. I miss you. A long silence stretched between them. A year ago, those words would have broken her. Now, she felt nothing but clarity. You don't miss me, Emily said quietly. You miss what I used to do for you. Jessica's eyes welled with tears. That's not true. It is. Emily cut her off. You never saw me. Jessica, None of you did. I spent my entire life trying to be good enough for a family that only cared about me when they needed something. And now that I'm not playing that role anymore, you suddenly want me back. Jessica wiped at her eyes. I'm trying. Emily. Emily studied her for a long moment. Maybe she was. But that wasn't Emily's burden to carry anymore. I hope you figure it out, Emily said softly. Jessica opened her mouth as if to say more but seemed to think better of it. Take care, Emily, she whispered before standing and walking out the door. Emily sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat across from her. Then, she exhaled. Her sister was lost, just like their parents. And Emily? She had finally found herself. That night, she walked through her quiet apartment, the city skyline stretching out before her. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And for the first time, that was enough.